parables of Jesus. So the parables of Jesus are amazing. The more you read them, the more you realize that God was speaking through Jesus, because no person could ever develop this line of thinking and communicate so well and speak parables which are universally accepted throughout the whole world. Just an amazing thing. So we'll start with 18:1 of Luke. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. So the group addressed here are disciples. And this little section is going to talk about persistence in prayer, which I think is a good thing for us to understand. He said, in a certain town, there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared about men. There was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, "Grant me justice against my adversary." Now, back in the time of Jesus, women didn't have the kind of status they have today. They really were basically without a lot of authority. And if you were a widow, that means you didn't have anyone to really look out for you. And so you're really in a position of powerlessness. And it would be extremely hard for a woman to bring any pressure against a judge. But in this parable, this woman, being fairly clever and persistent, finds a way to get the judge's attention. For some time, I don't know how long, but for some time, he refused to listen to her. But finally, he said to himself, "Even though I don't fear God or care about men, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so she won't eventually wear me out with her coming." Which, once again, this is kind of an odd parable. You see Jesus kind of standing up for justice and standing up for this woman. And then the Lord explains the parable, because most of the time the disciples didn't get it. I mean, it wasn't they were dense, because they're just ordinary people off the street. I mean, fishermen, a tax collector, and some other people didn't even know what their occupations were. I mean, they're probably the sharpest people that Jesus could find in the north part of Israel, up in the hills. But he explained to them. The Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge said. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones?" Notice who's addressed here. The chosen ones. Not just anybody on the street, but the chosen ones. Those who he has already made commitment to. Who cry out to him day and night. Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? This is kind of a little interesting, ironical note. And he's telling this to his disciples, so he's kind of encouraging them to stay with it. So at this time, it's time for an illustration. Fortunately, I have one or two. Real life stories, just as real as this parable, because done by God. So some years ago, actually it was November 26th, in the morning, the Lord said to me, "I would like you to go down and pray at Christian Life Center." And I thought, "Oh, okay, well, I'll do that. I'd like you to do it today." I thought, "Oh my gosh, today? It's like 8 o'clock in the morning. Just go down." And so I went down. I started praying outside. And of course, nobody knew I was doing it, so the door was locked. Nobody was there. I think it was like on a Thursday or something. Nobody around. And I was there for about a week or two, and then someone noticed and heard about this. "Oh, well, we'll give you the key, the door key, so you can get inside and pray," because after all, it's November and it's kind of cold outside, and we don't want you sitting in the car and praying. So eventually some people joined me. Well, fast forward about 4 years, and the Spirit of the Lord was bringing people to pray, a few here and a few there, and there's some very solid people, kind of like this woman in the story. And all of a sudden they said, well, we're going to hire a youth pastor. Well, it's a little church of about 30 or 40 people, you know, wow. And that was a little stretch for them, but they've hired a youth pastor now. And so the youth pastor is getting ready, as I was saying, to become a pastor to Santa Cruz High.
Oh, wow.
And he's decided that he's going to open the church up on Tuesday mornings and serve coffee and donuts to the kids who are right close by the church, because it's not very far away. And we've seen kids actually parking in the parking lot sometimes. So that's an example of God answering prayer, because although SLB has a couple of Christian groups, and in fact they're going to have now a Fellowship of Christian Athletes there, as well as a Christian club, and Scotts Valley has also a Christian club. Santa Cruz High did not, so this is up and coming and will be in place probably at least by the first of the year. They're going to start out with coffee and donuts and see where it goes from there. So that's kind of a cool thing.
Yeah. That's
an example of consistent prayer. And then a friend of mine, I think you know Dr. Steve Stiles, who's been here from time to time. One day he calls me up, because we were getting together and praying in the morning. He says, John, get in the car. Steve is a rather direct guy sometimes, as you know. And so I got in the car and we drive down to Santa Cruz Community Church, which is a huge building on Roxas. I mean, you could put 400 or 500, 600 people in that church. But it has about 30 or 40 people, and they're getting older. If you think you're getting older, well, add 10 years and now you're really getting older. And so they started praying. And we went down there and we would pray in the morning at 7:30, which is pretty early for me, but going each day. And recently they hired an outreach minister. And there's two churches with 30 or 40 people who suddenly said, we're going to risk what we have financially, and in faith, we're going to hire somebody who can start bringing people into the church and building it up again. And this is an example. Steve has been going down there and praying for 4 or 5 years. I was with him for quite a while until I just couldn't get up that early in the morning anymore. But I still have a couple of places I pray in the morning. But anyway, the example here is that consistent, persistent prayer has results. And also in God's timing. And I think that's what we find in prayer. God has a timing that's different than our own. But He understands and hears our prayers. And so the next little parable that comes along tells us a little bit more. To some who were confident in their own righteousness. Now, I don't think that applies to people here. It applied more probably to the Pharisees and Sadducees of Jesus' day, who were kind of cocky, and they thought they had a handle on everything. And of course, Jesus had some struggles with them, verbal struggles. But it says, some were confident in their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else. That's not a good thing. It's better to be humble than to be proud. Jesus told this parable. So this is a different group. He's not addressing his disciples this time. And it's important, when you're reading the words of Jesus, kind of notice who he's talking to. If he's talking to you, well then, listen up. If he's talking to somebody else, you can kind of observe through the window, so to speak, because it doesn't apply to you. But somehow Jesus' parables always seem to apply to us a little bit. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. So far, so good. The Pharisee stood and prayed about himself. Or some translations say, prayed to himself. Not too helpful, by the way. God, I thank you I'm not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven. He beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. It's very interesting. Because if we're really honest and we're having a moment of clarity, we are going to be able to say, oh, I kind of know that I'm more like the tax collector than the Pharisee, I hope. Because if I'm like the Pharisee, I'm praying to myself. But if I'm like the tax collector, God is hearing me. Jesus said, I tell you, this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted, which is very interesting, very interesting. Being exalted because you're putting yourself down. In other words, God sees your heart and doesn't really want us to be put down. He just wants us to be a little bit humble. Now, the third parable I had a lot of trouble with. The reason I had trouble with it is I wanted to relate it to the first two. But finally I realized, yes, it does relate to the first two. So here we go. People were also bringing babies to Jesus to have him touch them. When the disciples saw this, they rebuked them. Now, why was that? Well, if you're a rabbi, you're supposed to be dealing with adults. Kids are to be seen but not heard. You know, the kids just didn't have much say in the culture of that day. Not much going on with kids. But Jesus called the children to himself and said, let the little children come to me, don't hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. So that's pretty interesting, because somehow there's an object lesson being taught here about humility and openness of heart. Children have humility, they have openness of heart, they believe that which they're told. I tell you the truth, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter in. And so the kingdom of God, or the rule of God in our lives, is to be accepted as it is. Not with critique, not with analysis, but just, God, I'm just going to try to follow you. I'm going to try to do what you would have me to do. I'm going to try to please you. And I'm be like a child would come to you. If you've ever heard a child pray, a good example of this. So I have a little, well, he's now about this tall, but he used to be this tall. Little Isaac. Isaac is extremely verbal. It's hard to believe that at 3 years old he was able to, every night he would pray, I'm praying for Grandpa that his leg is going to heal up. That's when I was, right after I had my knee replacement surgery, and he would pray that, you know, and very direct, and I think God heard his prayer because, you know, this last year, my step count from January to about 3 days ago when I visited the doctor was 431,000 steps, which represents about 450 miles. So I guess that prayer was heard. And here was a little guy praying for his grandfather, and it just touched my heart. Just touched my heart. And when we come to God as we really are, and we tell him the truth about ourselves in humility and honestly, as these other two parables, and really lay it out there and keep on laying it out there before him, I believe those are the prayers that are heard, whatever the situation is. We have need for prayer. We have need for prayer. And I think sometimes, and it's hard to say this, but I think sometimes God allows us to go through trouble because that kind of tunes us up for actually wanting to pray. Because we realize, oh, this is a little bit more than I expected or anticipated. This is a little bit over my head. God, I'm going to put this in your hands. I'm going to try to leave it there for a moment. And I'm going to let you go ahead and take care of this. There's a woman I'm counseling right now, or at least I'm visiting with her by phone. And she has a medication problem where she got off this one medication. I'm not going to mention what it was, but it was prescribed, and she's had an awful time getting off of it. And so I talked with her, and I said, can I pray for you? And I prayed just a few words. I mean, no long prayer, just a few words. And she always says, thank you very much. You know, I can tell you care about who I am and what's happening for me. And so that's kind of what's in this little section here of parables that Jesus taught about prayer. He taught about prayer because apparently, just like we are, the people of that day had trouble understanding how to talk with God. And so Jesus kind of broke it down. He made it simple. He made it very straightforward. And I think that's why my heart and mind and I were drawn to these three parables of Jesus about prayer. And of course, Jesus taught the disciples how to pray. And then if you ever read in John 16 and 17 and 18, there's Jesus' prayer to the Father. So if you want to go up to the graduate level of prayer, that's one where there's no end of the depth of that prayer. For the rest of us, probably the Lord's Prayer is sufficient. You know, give us this day our daily bread, and hallowed be thy name. Well, we're going to